Part 11. Alright, now we find ourselves at Genesis 3:15, which says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall crush your head, and you shall crush his heel." This is a commonly used passage to speak about a coming prophecy, or the prophecy that Jesus would, in the future, crush Satan. However, I made a side note that even amongst Christian scholars, not all of them would agree that this is a clear and consistent prophecy and that it is still subjective in its interpretation. But with that in mind, let's transport ourselves to the BC era and see what's going on. Now, I made a very interesting observation as I was studying this, that Satan is actually nowhere mentioned in any of these first chapters of Genesis. Nor are we told that the snake is some kind of embodiment of Satan or is Satan. So we can't assume that the devil, if you will, went into the snake and was the one that tempted Eve. The devil, if you will, is nowhere mentioned in these chapters or instance, which is interesting. Wondering if you've ever thought about that, because I know I never had. Alright, so here in the story, the serpent is a physical, literal snake animal, which at some point had legs. And as a side note, science will actually confirm that snakes have the configuration to have legs, yet they don't. Of course, scientists would say that, snakes used to have legs and evolved to not through, Darwinian theory, which I don't believe in evolution, but I think it's really cool that science can kind of back the story here in Genesis that snakes apparently once had legs. Pretty cool. Alright, anyways, for whatever reason not spoken about in the Bible, the serpent tempts Eve to eat of the tree she was not supposed to. And another side note, I'm going to get off on rabbit trails today, I'm sorry, but another side note is that isn't it interesting that God still holds us accountable for what we were even deceived to do accidentally? So our intentions don't even matter. Perhaps Eve really wanted to be like God because we're also told, to be like him, to be perfect as Elohim is perfect in other parts of the Bible. So it's not really a bad thing. And perhaps she was deceived to thinking that this was how it was going to please him, even though it meant disobeying him. And we hear that a lot today, like, hey, we don't have to keep the law, or in other words, we can disobey because it's what matters in our heart. As long as we're disobeying, but we have good intentions, then he accepts that. But in the case of Eve, it kind of didn't matter what her intentions were. It didn't overrule obedience. But I digress. So we know that it is an animal that is doing the tempting for whatever reason, and a figurehead known as Satan is nowhere to be mentioned here. This is about a created animal and Eve. So after both Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, they had to take part in the punishment for their disobedience, and that actually didn't disclude the snake as well, because he also did something wrong. He too was cursed, as well as the humans who took part in it. And by the way, if the snake was Satan, how can you curse Satan who is already believed to be separated and cursed by Yehovah? Just a thought. So when Yehovah comes to all three of them took part in being given physical curses, yet only one of them is singled out as prophetic? Why? Is it because you've already decided on the verdict before the trial even began? So I took a closer look at the Hebrew word for offspring or seed, and in Hebrew that word is zerah. Usually it is used to talk about the offspring that come from men, because the family name and family genealogy always go through the man. But this verse seems to be pegged also as messianic for this reason that Eve is spoken of as having her offspring or seed, or as having offspring or seed, crush the head of the snake. But when I looked, though, this isn't out of the ordinary, because women are described as having seed in the Bible. It's nothing more than the word offspring. I mean, if you're a girl here listening and you've had a baby, you've had offspring. Just is what it is. Alright, so here are a few verses from the Tanakh that use this word zerah, which is used here in Genesis 3:15 to describe women having offspring or descendants. So in Genesis 16:10, Hagar is referred to having seed. In Genesis 24:16, Rebecca has seed. Leviticus 22:13 speaks about the priest's daughters having seed, and Numbers 5:28 speaks about woman who will bear seed. And the woman there is just kind of in general for all women. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 1, Sarah also asks for seed. So this word seed used here in Genesis 3:15 is not out of the ordinary. It's just telling the BC reader that those who come after Eve, or rather her descendants, will crush the heads of snakes. Why? Because now the snake has to slither on the ground at the feet of all mankind. There was something about the change of the physical body of the snake that would make him in such a way that would be repulsive to humans, and therefore, when caught off guard, the snake would be crushed as to deal with him. And how humiliating to be a creature who was once perhaps upright and lovely, that now has to crawl and grovel, so to speak, on his belly for all existence. And in all reality, there is something to this day about girls not liking snakes. I know I'd rather be put in a room alone with a lion than with a snake. And yes, that is very irrational based on the fact that I literally would have no chance up against a lion. But I do think that's part of the curse given to the snake, that the women will always have a hatred for the snake. And we see evidence of this today. I hate snakes, yet they're literally harmless to me, unless they're poisonous, but that's a different story. The other common viewpoint I looked at for this verse was that it says in the masculine form, he will crush your head. And therefore, the he has to indicate that it's speaking about Jesus, which, let's be honest, that's a big assumption on the part of the reader, because also this Hebrew word used also means that or which. Now, these are masculine forms, and by the way, every word has either a feminine or masculine quality, but that is not imperative of meaning that this is talking about a man or a woman. Why the translator chose he instead of using that or which is perhaps agenda-driven. The verse could easily read, quote, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your descendants and her descendants. They shall crush your head, and you shall crush his heel." Using the term they would make more sense, because the word for offspring is always known to mean more than one. It's plural. Abraham's seed was not known as just one person, but a whole nation of people that came from him. So all seed, or they, will crush the head of the snake. Why? Because he's cursed. He can't walk upright anymore. And we're not just talking about one person. So using the plural word, or the phrase, they shall crush your head, mixed with the phrase, you will crush his heel, still is not indicative of one-time event with the serpent. First of all, we know that Satan is nowhere mentioned in this passage or event. We can see something similar in the mixing of plural with singular nouns to refer to a group of people, and Deuteronomy 28:12 is a good example of this. It speaks about the coming prosperity of the whole of Israel, that they would be so fruitful that they would not be indebted to anyone. And it says you, and that word you is the same that's used in the Genesis 3:15 account. It says you, as in Israel, you will lend from many nations, but you will borrow from none. The you and the you will borrow and you will lend is not talking about one person. It's talking about the group of Israel. And this is the same word that's used for the you will crush his heel in Genesis 3:15. Okay, so there are other instances in the Hebrew text where this is done. The word for you is often used to depict a plural picture, but no, not always. You don't see this in the English language to depict it as plural here, but it makes sense because the context is about seed or offspring, and offspring isn't just one person. So this verse doesn't seem to indicate anything about one person if you go look at it at the Hebrew. However, through translators, it would seem that there's definitely a sway in how it was chosen to be translated into the English. A native Hebrew speaker would not see such a thing. As a BC reader, I would understand this passage to, first of all, be a narrative of what just happened to Adam and Eve and the curses that came to all three of them. I couldn't try to make the connection to Jesus, but only if I had already believed in him and by not understanding the Hebrew words better in its language setting. I said it before earlier in this writing that you can go from Jesus to Genesis, but you can't go from Genesis to Jesus. And this would be an example of retrofitting something back into the text. But for the sake of argument, let's say this is messianic in some way. What then does it tell us? Well, it says nothing about a Messiah directly. Could it be symbolic, though, in nature? Well, I think so, sure. But we would also have to look at it in this way as an assumption or a supposition on one's part left to open interpretation. And the question is, though, okay, did Jesus in fact crush the head of Satan? Well, it never says he did. And then actually, in Romans 16:10, Paul, who's writing this in the late first century, is saying that God will soon crush Satan under your feet. Wait a second. I thought, though, through this prophecy or connection that what Jesus did was supposed to crush Satan. If Jesus was in fact supposed to reverse the curse of what happened in the garden, then something's really wrong. The curse given to men was that work would be hard and that we would have to live by the sweat of our brow. And for women, that we would have great pains in childbirth, and as for the snake, they would crawl on their bellies and men would be able to crush them, regardless of how they try to strike at the heel. If Jesus was to reverse the curse, then why do we still have labor pains? And why do we still have to labor in the sun to eat a meager bite of food? Why do snakes still slither? After all, those were the given curses, and Jesus did not reverse any of them. Why does Paul say that God still hasn't crushed Satan? No one even in the New Testament writings reference this as a messianic prophecy or fulfillment of Jesus or even a connection. This passage in Genesis 3:15 just does not make it very clear, and it is questionable that it is even a messianic reference here in Genesis. If in fact messianic, I could see how the coming Messiah would in fact crush the head of Satan, so to speak. Yet today, Satan is still at large, men still struggle with sin, and Paul is telling us, even after the life of Jesus, that Satan has not yet been crushed. Then the thought could be something to the effect of, well, okay, that'll be done when Jesus comes again in his second coming. To have to revert to this kind of logic is to have to admit then that Jesus did not fulfill any prophecy here. To say that in the first coming, nothing from the clear prophecies were fulfilled and it will be done later, is to then admit that he wasn't the Messiah according to clear prophecy. And even in the case with the Genesis passage that Jesus didn't fulfill the crushing of the head of the serpent metaphorically, when we have Paul saying that Satan still hasn't been crushed. So not even this metaphorical asserted connection, did Jesus do anything? Now, if Jesus was the real Messiah and does come back for a second round and fulfills the clear prophecy, sure, let's talk at that point. But as of right now, there's nothing Jesus has fulfilled that would give me the reason to believe he was the person Yehovah was talking about through his prophets. How can I be held then responsible for not believing in someone Yehovah never told me to believe in? Honestly, if you can make a passage mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything. Let me say that again. Honestly, if you can make a passage mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything. Really, I see that if we can take a passage like the one here in Genesis and morph it into what we already believe, then we can morph anything into Scripture what we want to believe. And that's really what I see going on here. This passage in Genesis is for sure a narrative of what happened in the time of the garden, and that's about all we can get from it. Not too long ago, we had to demolish our old hen house so that we could build a new one for our chickens. When I knocked down one of the walls, out pops a huge, well, it wasn't that big. To me at the time it was huge, but out pops a rat snake. Okay, so I know they're harmless, but as most women still seem to be cursed with this hating of these harmless things, I was caught off guard and had a case of the geese as it slithered out towards me. I realized I had no shovel or any tool in my hand which I could lop its head off. So that day, I fulfilled the prophecy given in Genesis 3:15. With no other choice in the moment, I crushed its head with my heel. It was finished. Okay, so moving on, we have our next prophecy, which would be Genesis 22:8. And this is about Abraham. I would encourage you to read the whole passage if you're not familiar with it, but this is about Abraham and potentially having to sacrifice his son, but the verse given is from Genesis 22:8. I think I've mentioned that. All right, it says, "And Abraham said, My son Elohim does provide for himself the lamb for an ascending offering. And the two of them went together." Most people would be familiar with the story about Abraham almost giving his son as an offering. This would be considered by messianic to be a type and shadow of Jesus taking our place, just like the ram took the place of Isaac on that day. As a BC era reader, what would I see here? Well, for starters, I would see this as a narrative of something that happened to Abraham and his son. Could it be a type and shadow? Perhaps. What would this message be telling me about the coming Messiah? There's no indication of what to be looking for, or of the character of the Messiah. And those are assumptions you'd have to make having already believed in Jesus. The passage in its context does not indicate that it had anything to do with the Messiah, but rather about the faithfulness and obedience of Abraham. So much so that he would be willing to give up the thing he had waited so long to have. He would be willing to give up the one thing he was promised to be a continuation of his seed. There's the word zera, offspring. And that couldn't have made sense to him, but he trusted in Yehovah just that much. And the focal point of this narrative is about the faithfulness of Abraham. Now, I suppose we could insert a Jesus narrative into this story, and if we did, would it still work? The animal found in the bush was a ram, which makes me wonder if Jesus was called the Ram of God. Okay, yes, I write that with a little fun sarcasm. But there's no indication that the offering Abraham made was a sin offering. There are many different kinds of offerings, and only a few which would have been for sin. If we are to say that this ram was for a sin offering, or at least by the instructions of the Torah, which I understand at this point weren't given until Sinai, but there was never such a thing as a male lamb that could atone for sins. And I'm not joking there. There is no sin offering that has anything to do with a male lamb. Any sin offering brought that was to be of a lamb was to be a female. Other animals, such as a bull or goat, for example, were to be male, but absolutely zero cases of the instructions being for a lamb to be a male, if it is to be a sin offering. Now, I make note of these details because if we are going with symbolic or allegorical, those parts don't match up. You have to pick apart the story to make some parts work while others don't. Well, why is that? And just a quick thought about the Passover lamb as a side note. The Passover lamb did have to be a young male that was unblemished. And this means that the lamb taken to be offered could not have had marks on his back, could not have been whipped or beaten before being presented, or be wearing a crown of thorns for that matter. And if it were, it would not have been accepted by Yehovah. The Passover lamb given in the Passover lamb given in Exodus, then offered yearly as commemoration of what Yehovah did for his people coming out of Egypt. I'm really messing this up. What am I trying to say here? Okay, the Passover lamb given in the Exodus, then offered yearly as a commemoration of what Yehovah did for his people coming out of Egypt. That's all it was, but it was never a sin offering given for the atonement of sins. That's not what the Passover about. Nothing about the Passover is for the atonement of sins. If we are to say that Jesus stepped in as the Passover lamb, as it says in the New Testament, Jesus our Passover lamb, then to keep true to the types and shadows, he could not have been presented as a beaten, skin-torn human, nor could he atoned for sins, because there are no lambs that are male that could make atonement for this. It would have made more sense, however, if Jesus had died on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement for Israel, but that takes place in the fall. I see on a superficial level how the idea of types and shadows is placed on the story, but that does not give anyone a clear, concrete evidence about a Messiah to come. To the BC era reader, this would not have been anything more than a writing of an event that took place. So I can't rightfully look into this passage to collect information regarding the coming Messiah. We can read anything into the text of Scripture, and that's why we have videos on YouTube titled "Trump Predicted in the Bible." I've heard the idea, though, that, perhaps this is the point of Scripture, that perhaps we're not given all the revelation until the time comes, and then we can see it looking back. And I understand this totally, and it's a great argument to make. However, I really cannot find another example of Yehovah doing this or operating in this manner. There are no examples of him revealing something later in a time period, only to have, the people look back and see, that the whole time it was there, they've just missed it. And you'd think, as big of an issue as Jesus is, something would be 100% clearly written about him. Amos 3:7 speaks about the concept that Yehovah does not do anything lest he reveal it first to his prophets. And as a side note, did his prophets reveal anything in an allegorical, subjective message? No, they were very clear-cut. And this is what Yehovah does in every case I can think of. He tells what he is going to do in advance before he does it. Nothing comes as a surprise. So much so that he didn't even bring calamity on Egypt except telling Pharaoh first. And when Israel was in the desert, he was super clear about what he was going to do with them and the events that were about to prevail them. Nineveh was warned by Jonah that destruction was coming unless they changed, and the list could go on. Surely, something as big as who Jesus is made out to be in the Christian world as the foundation of their faith would have been clearly revealed. Yehovah does not hide what's going to happen. He had his prophets reveal what the world would look like at the time of the Messiah in the clear, consistent passages. What we have informationally about the Messiah can't be trumped by the passages that lurk in the shadows. So the clear, consistent passages about the Messiah have to interpret the passages we might not be so clear about. In other words, the tail can't wag the dog. And I think this is true for any interpretation of Scripture. There are hands-down clear passages in any case. Passages that are clear and in the open, in the light, so to speak. Then there'll always be passages that are a bit shadowy to us, which we're unsure about the meaning of. But the shadowy passages cannot interpret the clear, open passages. The clear, open passages have to be the ones to interpret the shadowy passages, right? Again, the dog wags the tail, not the other way around. This account about Abraham and his son really is difficult to think about in any other way than symbolic of a future coming Jesus when you have been raised as a Christian. And trust me, I get it. We are mainly taught to see Jesus in everything because we have made it all about the first century Jesus and nothing else. I know I'm rambling a bit here, but let me just share one other thought. There are different ways of interpreting Scripture. The literal and then more allegorical. The literal reading of the passage would have been what is literally taking place, such as the story of Abraham and his son. And the allegorical interpretation would have been more about what the story is alluding to or symbolic of. And that's what I've already been talking about, looking at a passage through the type and shadow lens. I would have to be honest and admit that those types and shadows are subjected to the interpretation of an individual or governing body, which means that not everyone will come to a universal, clear understanding of the shadow. Therefore, the shadow will never be concrete. What seems to be the case in the prophecies listed by the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, such as in the case of Hosea 1:11, which we've already talked about, is that they are giving what appears to be their own interpretation of what they think the Tanakh passage means. The writer of Matthew, as we've seen, lops off one line in Hosea that says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," leaving out all the surrounding text. And by this one-liner to mean that because Jesus came out of Egypt, then this must be a fulfilled prophecy. However, we see in that context that this is not at all what this verse is saying. The writer of Matthew is asserting his subjective interpretation. However, we as individuals are still in need of looking at it for ourselves in the book of Hosea, not just taking someone's word for it. I did this my whole freaking life, and I'm not doing anymore. And I can't do that just because somebody whose book ended up in the canonized version of the Bible is there. You still have to look at those things for yourself. And what I'm about to say, I can't emphasize more. So listen very closely. By needing to believe in Jesus only because there are hints of him in the scriptures, along with stories of Trump and Hillary and Obama, is to then admit that the Tanakh does not plainly teach about Jesus. It is to admit that the Tanakh does not speak of him. Let me read that again. By needing to believe in Jesus only because there are hints of him in the scriptures, is to then admit that the Tanakh does not plainly teach about Jesus. It is to admit that the Tanakh does not speak of him. So now I would be asked to accept a speculative, subjective, allegorical figurative interpretation about what the scriptures might be alluding to and make that the foundation of my faith. Let me read that again. So, and this is what I can't emphasize enough. So I would then be asked to accept a speculative, subjective, allegorical, figurative interpretation about what the scriptures might be alluding to and make that the foundation of my faith. Is that what we're supposed to do? So at the end of the day, the burden of proof is still on the writers of the New Testament to show that the man they're claiming is the Messiah is in fact the Messiah based on what the prophets clearly gave us in the Tanakh. And looking unbiasedly at what the New Testament writers give is still not clear. It's still subjective and speculative and allegorical and figurative in its soundbite pieces of verses taken out of context. I think we forget too that whoever did write the Gospels were in fact just men. Mind blown. These were just men. They were subject to their own beliefs and interpretations and do not get a higher rank above what Yehovah says in his words. It would be very easy to have a first century author write about an allegorical level interpretation, doing their best to prove that Jesus was indeed the Messiah because they believed he was. And over time, it's possible that what was believed to be an allegory form became morphed into believing that the Tanakh was concretely talking about Jesus based on the men who wrote the New Testament. Isn't it strange that no one ever asked questions as to whether or not the gospel writers had it all right? You know what I mean? They were men. Is it possible that they too had bias? It would be nice to know who these men even were. As I discussed earlier, that even Christian scholars admit that the gospel writers are anonymous. We have no authorship of these books on the speculation of men, the speculation at best is who could have written them. And if anyone wants to base their faith on allegorical or subjective material, more power to you. You have the right to do that. I now lean on the side of putting my faith in the clear words that our fathers spoke to our prophets that do tell us plainly, like, Prophecy for Dummies 101, you kind of can't miss it. But they tell us plainly what we need to know for life. And how could I go wrong with that? How can Yehovah's clear words ever be wrong? How then can I be held responsible for not believing in someone that the Father never told us to believe in? We have the words of a famous first century author of the Bible leading us to follow his own words. And you cannot deny that his own words are taken more seriously than the words of our everlasting God, Yehovah. Because when it comes to believing in the final words of God, or the words of any first century author, the first century author usually takes a higher rank. That's scary. Come on, you can't deny that the truth of that statement. And hint, this person's name is Paul. And it is true that anyone who wants to make a claim about anything, well, the burden of proof is on them. The burden of proof to show that Jesus was the Messiah was on the first century authors. They would have been living with BC era readers. Their biblical proofs really weren't proofs, but one-liners cherry-picked out of context, to mean something subjective and mystical in its interpretation. And that's not proof, that's just one person's opinion. What matters, their opinions or God's everlasting word? I say all this because the story about Abraham is not the only one listed as a type and shadow. And if I'm reading about Abraham and Isaac and I lived 30 years before the first century, what would it have meant? Why would Yehovah have included in the Torah? Why would Yehovah have included this in the Torah, and what is it supposed to show us in the BC era? The clear meaning of the text is that it was a narrative about the event that took place in one of our forefathers' lives. It shows the faithfulness of one man. All in all, we have all heard the saying, love is blind. And honestly, when people are in love, they don't see straight. If people want so much to see Jesus everywhere, then that love and that passion for him can distort the way we actually look at the Tanakh. I had found that to be true after taking an unbiased approach to the Tanakh. I had also been guilty of that. I feel the same way towards the next passage on the list about the snake being lifted up on the pole, that we've made it into more than what it is because our love and passion for something blinds us. And here's the next one in Numbers, but we're going to continue that on the next part. So this is the end of part 11.